This photograph was taken on a cold, rain-soaked morning in March 1945, or so the surviving records claim. The location is listed only as somewhere along the Western Front, and the name of the U.S. Army photographer who captured it has been lost to time. But look closely. Who are these two German women, drenched in mud and trembling as if pulled from the earth itself? Why is the American soldier kneeling before them, not with a weapon, but with his hands gripping her injured leg, as though saving her from something far worse than battle? And what happened just seconds before the shutter clicked, when smoke still drifted behind them and the ground shook beneath their feet? Some say this image hides a story of terror. Others say it hides a miracle. Today, we uncover what truly happened in the minutes surrounding this frozen moment. April 30th, 1945. A makeshift American POW collection yard outside Leipzig, Germany. The war in Europe has only days left to live. The morning light is thin and metallic, barely cutting through the smoke drifting from burned fields beyond the fence. The yard itself is little more than a rectangle of churned mud, lined with loose wooden posts and sagging strands of barbed wire. Dirt clings to every boot print. The air tastes of ashes and cold iron. A cluster of German women stands near the center, their bodies drawn close as if trying to hold one another upright. Their dresses hang in tatters, sleeves frayed, hems stiff with dried mud. Their shoes, if they have shoes at all, are cracked and uneven. Among them is 24-year-old Elise Weber, her fingers wrapped tightly around a small wooden medical box pressed against her ribs. She holds it the way a drowning person clings to a floating board, her knuckles pale beneath the grime. None of the women speak. They have been taught for years that Americans humiliate captured women, that surrender means shame, punishment, or worse. Silence feels safer than breath. Above them, a gray sky broods. Every distant engine rumble makes the group flinch. Every boot step from the American line tightens their shoulders. The yard's stillness is stretched so thin it could snap from the weight of a single shout. Elise tries to ignore the growing heat beneath the wooden box, telling herself it's only the rising sun, only nerves, only imagination. Then the smell hits. Sharp, chemical, sour like metal dipped in vinegar. Elise winces, shifting uncomfortably, one hand sliding instinctively to her right side. She presses the cloth of her dress, feeling something warm beneath it. The air around her seems suddenly too tight to breathe. A medic on the far side of the yard turns his head. Another soldier sniffs the air. Nobody understands what they're smelling yet, least of all, Elise. A shout breaks the fragile quiet. "Carter, now, over here!" The words slice through the yard, and every German woman stiffens. Elise's breath catches. A young American soldier, Private Leonard Carter, races toward her, boots throwing up flecks of mud. His face is urgent, not angry, but Elise cannot hear tone. She hears only speed, only danger, only everything she was warned about. He shouts something at the medic behind him, but the women do not understand English. They hear noise and assume violence. Elise steps back, clutching the box, her heart pounding hard enough to shake her ribs. Carter keeps coming. He sees the stain spreading along her dress, the darkened patch clinging to her side, the faint shimmer of liquid eating through the fabric. For him, it's training. Chemical burn, seconds matter, remove contaminated cloth. For her, it is the nightmare made real. Carter reaches her, palms open in a gesture meant to calm. Elise recoils, stumbling. The women cry out. A nervous guard fumbles his rifle, the metal clattering against a rock. The medic is still shouting. "Don't touch it! Get the cloth off her!" But to Elise the words might as well be thunder. Carter grabs the edge of her dress. Elise screams. The fabric tears in a single, violent rip that echoes across the yard like a gunshot. Loose threads scatter into the air. The women gasp, some covering their mouths, others turning away. Elise collapses to her knees, arms instinctively crossing her chest as the cold air strikes her exposed skin. For a heartbeat, nobody moves. Dust hangs suspended between them. Carter kneels, breathing hard, holding the torn cloth away from her body so the burning liquid won't reach deeper. The medic sprints forward, canteen already open, dousing the ground where the chemical hisses and smokes. Elise trembles, eyes wide, seeing only violation. She cannot comprehend that the young American crouching beside her is trying to save her flesh, not shame her. Then, gently, almost shyly, Carter removes his jacket and drapes it over her shoulders, careful not to touch the injured side. Elise flinches anyway. She doesn't look at him. Her breath shakes unevenly, the fear rising like a tide she cannot stop. The yard remains frozen, the torn piece of her dress hanging from Carter's hand like a flag of surrender she never meant to wave. What you're seeing looks like an assault. But in the last days of World War II, this moment became proof of something very different about America. Only days earlier, President Franklin Roosevelt had died, and a young, untested Harry Truman had taken the helm of a nation spread across the globe. Yet the machinery of American war, its factories, its convoys, its soldiers, continued to run with the same relentless precision. Back home, the United States was still the arsenal of democracy, churning out Liberty ships and B-24 bombers, stamping Jeep frames by the hour, feeding its troops on rations of 3,500 to 4,000 calories a day. While Europe fell into starvation, American mess halls served meat, fruit, coffee, and bread that never crumbled into dust. More than abundance, though, America carried something else into the final days of the war: rules, discipline, the obligation, hammered into officers and enlisted men alike, to uphold the 1929 Geneva Convention. Even when fighting the regime responsible for the war, even when exhausted by years of combat, American soldiers were instructed to treat prisoners humanely, especially women, especially the terrified. That is the world Carter came from, a nation powerful enough to destroy cities, yet determined to hold itself to a higher standard. A nation that believed mercy was not weakness but proof of strength. But Elise doesn't know any of this. She only feels the cold, the panic, the torn fabric against her skin. She only knows the stories she grew up with. Americans take what they want. Americans punish surrender. Americans have no honor. To understand why a young American tore a German woman's dress open, we have to go back to the beginning of her fear. Elise Weber had grown up in a world where fear was not an emotion but a curriculum. In Munich, the lessons began early. Mornings started with radio broadcasts blaring warnings about foreign enemies who tortured prisoners and destroyed German womanhood. Posters hung on every street corner, all sharp angles and hollow eyes, painting Americans as monsters with grinning teeth and blood-stained hands. In school, teachers repeated the same lines until they became truth simply through repetition. One instructor from the Hitlerjugend had stood before her class when she was no older than 12, his voice cutting the air like a blade. "Better to die," he said, "than fall into enemy hands." He spoke as though he were doing them a kindness, giving them a rule that would protect them. Elise remembered the silence that followed, thick, obedient, unquestioned. Children nodded. She nodded. What else was there to do? By 1943, Munich shook nearly every night. Allied bombers swept in waves overhead, their engines so constant they became part of the season like winter wind. Elise had spent more hours underground than in daylight, huddled inside concrete bunkers that smelled of damp wool and fear. She learned to recognize the different tones of falling bombs. She learned to listen for her mother's breath in the dark. Sometimes, after the all-clear sirens wailed, she and her neighbors would climb out to find a familiar street torn open, roofs blown away, horse-drawn carts smashed to splinters. Food grew scarce. Fat disappeared from diets first, then meat, then even decent bread. People stretched barley with sawdust and boiled potato peels until the water turned gray. Elise's father, conscripted early in the war, had not written home in months. Her mother pretended calm, but Elise heard her crying in the hallway late at night. Somewhere in the rubble of the collapsing Reich, hope was eroding, and fear was becoming the country's last reliable fuel. Yet even as Germany crumbled, the propaganda grew louder. The world, outside their borders, was portrayed as a jungle of predators, especially the Americans. They were described as undisciplined, lustful, vengeful. Foreign soldiers have no honor, Elise had been told countless times. If you are captured, nothing good will follow. The message was so constant it became instinct. Surrender meant violation. Survival meant avoiding the enemy at all costs. The contrast with the actual world beyond Germany's borders could not have been sharper. In the United States, while men marched across continents, the home front surged with energy. Women stepped into vast factory lines, welding steel plates to Liberty ships and riveting bomber wings under the call of Rosie the Riveter. Americans bought war bonds in grocery stores and at church gatherings, creating a sense of shared purpose. They believed, deeply, that they were fighting to build a safer, more moral world. Even at war's peak, they were never taught to hate the prisoners who would eventually fall into their custody. Elise didn't know any of that. Her world was narrower, darker, shaped by the steady drip of terrifying stories. And by 1944, the fear was accompanied by hunger, by exhaustion, by the knowledge that the walls of the Reich were collapsing, and no one knew what the next day might bring. The rumors worsened as Germany began to retreat on both the eastern and western fronts. Women heard horror stories whispered behind closed doors. The Russians will take everything from you, some said. The Americans will humiliate you, others insisted. It didn't matter which warning Elise heard. They all tightened the knot in her stomach. Retreat meant exposure. Exposure meant capture. And capture, according to everything she had been taught, was a fate worse than death. One afternoon during the chaotic withdrawal from a field station, a wounded officer thrust a small wooden medical box into Elise's hands. His face was pale, streaked with dirt, but his voice cut sharply through the noise of retreat. "Protect this," he told her. "Do not let it fall into enemy hands." He didn't explain what was inside, and Elise didn't dare ask. Orders were anchors in a collapsing world. She clung to the box, its weight strangely comforting at first. She didn't know it would soon become something far more dangerous. The retreat westward was a journey through a country dissolving into smoke and mud. Elise joined a ragged line of women, auxiliaries, clerks, nurses' aides, moving from burnt village to burnt village, their footsteps slow, their stomachs hollow. Farmhouses lay abandoned, animals dead in the fields, wells choked with debris. Civilians glared at them or avoided them entirely. Anger and fear mingled in equal measure. And then, one evening, beneath a bruised sky, The rumor struck like a physical blow. Hitler was dead. The women halted in the road. Some gasped, others cried. A few simply stared at the ground. For Elise, the news felt like a blade slicing through everything she had believed. If the Führer was gone, what did loyalty mean now? What did obedience mean? Who were they without the regime that had shaped their entire lives? But there was no time to fall apart. Artillery thundered in the distance. The Western Front was collapsing. The women were ordered to keep moving toward the American lines to avoid Soviet capture. Yet the closer they came to the Americans, the heavier their fear grew. Surrender meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant the nightmares they had been warned about. By the time they reached the outskirts of Leipzig, Elise's feet were blistered, her dress torn, her throat raw from thirst. Several women stumbled, supported only by the hands of those beside them. The wooden box hammered against her hip with every step, the latch rattling like a warning. She didn't know why it had begun to feel warmer. She didn't know the pain along her side was more than fatigue. The decision to surrender came not from courage but from collapse. They were starving, exhausted, cornered by the tide of war. A ruined barn stood near the road and beyond it. Through drifting smoke, they saw an American jeep idling. Soldiers watched from a checkpoint, helmets tilted, rifles slung but not raised. The women looked at one another. There were no speeches, no final vows, just a slow, collective lifting of hands, a gesture born not from trust, but from the absence of any other choice. For the first time, Elise allowed herself to imagine that the enemy might not kill her immediately. But the fear remained, deep and instinctive, like something carved into bone. Every step toward the Americans felt like stepping toward the mouth of a wolf. What she couldn't know, what no German girl could have understood from behind years of propaganda, was how different the American world truly was. Back home, factory whistles blew shifts into motion, lunch pails opened, and children played in neighborhoods untouched by rubble. The United States, strong and fed and driven by ideals larger than vengeance, had no need to brutalize the prisoners who would soon come under its care. Elise walked forward anyway, heart pounding, her wooden box thudding softly against her ribs. She had no idea that everything she believed was about to be tested and overturned within a single day. The women emerged from behind the shattered barn in a thin, wavering line, their hands raised high, their heads bowed so low they could see only the churned mud beneath their feet. They walked as if approaching a sentence, not a checkpoint. Elise felt the wooden box thump lightly against her hip with each step, its weight grounding her even as fear hollowed out her chest. Ahead of them, the American soldiers stood in uneven formation near the road. They were younger than Elise expected. Boys, really, wearing long M1943 field jackets that looked too big for their narrow shoulders. Their faces were smeared with dust, their eyes tired but not wild. No one shouted, "Halt!" No rifle was cocked and aimed at them. Instead, a young lieutenant stepped forward, his helmet slightly askew, and raised a single hand in a calm gesture. He spoke softly. The words were foreign, but the tone was unmistakably ordinary, almost gentle. He pointed toward a patch of gravel beside a supply truck and motioned for the women to wait there. The order lacked menace. It sounded more like a librarian asking patrons to form a line. Elise blinked, trying to reconcile this with everything she had been taught. Where were the screams, the threats, the humiliation? The women shuffled to the indicated spot, still trembling, still bracing for something they couldn't define. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and an unexpected undertone. Vegetables simmering, pepper, maybe broth. Elise couldn't remember the last time she had smelled warm food. Within minutes, American soldiers approached them, not with clubs or ropes, but with tin cups and dented cans. One soldier ladled steaming soup from a metal pot and handed cups to the women closest to him. Another passed out wool blankets pulled straight from a supply crate. Their movements were brisk, practiced, indifferent to the idea that these women had once been part of an enemy army. An elderly German woman near the front staggered suddenly. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed into the mud with a soft cry. Instantly, 2 American soldiers dropped to their knees beside her. Not a single inappropriate hand touched her. They slid their arms beneath her shoulders with the awkward care of men more familiar with rifles than with bodies, lifting her upright against a tree stump. One of them waved toward the medics, calling for water. Elise watched with her breath snagged in her throat. She had expected cruelty, hunger, punishment, not rescue. Steam curled from the soup pot in the center of the yard, drifting like a soft white ribbon across the morning air. Elise inhaled cautiously. Carrots, potatoes, salt. The aromas struck her with almost physical force. The last warm meal she had eaten had been weeks ago, a thin broth scraped from potato skins. Her stomach twisted painfully at the memory. She looked away from the pot, clutching the wooden box tighter. Kindness from the enemy felt more dangerous than hatred. Hatred, she understood. Kindness had no script, no warning, no defense. Every lesson she had ever learned whispered that this was a trap. "They want us to trust them," someone behind her muttered hoarsely. "Then they will strike." Elise didn't answer, but she felt the words burrow into her spine. What she could not see was the machinery behind this unexpected mercy. Thousands of miles away, American farms and factories were still humming, producing canned meat, fruit preserves, chocolate bars, condensed milk, and hardtack biscuits. Soldiers at the front received rations of nearly 3,700 to 40 calories a day, even in the final months of the war. That abundance spilled naturally into the treatment of prisoners. Where Germany rationed sawdust bread and turnip soup, America served full meals even to those who had surrendered. International Red Cross inspectors had filed report after report, noting how carefully American camps weighed each prisoner's ration. POWs were entitled to medical care, blankets, and humane shelter, even when American units themselves were exhausted. Some captured Germans were sent to camps in the United States, Canada, or Britain, where they worked on farms or in road crews, and were paid small wages they could later take home. In many camps, American guards enforced discipline not by brute force but by a strict adherence to rules that forbade unnecessary cruelty. None of that mattered to Elise in this moment. She only knew how tightly she had been taught to expect violence. When a soldier approached with a tin cup of water, she shook her head and stepped back. The soldier hesitated, confused, then simply placed the cup at her feet and moved on. His restraint unnerved her more than if he had barked an order. Another soldier held out a wool blanket, the edges still smelling faintly of machine oil from the supply truck. Elise pressed the box harder into her ribs, refusing the blanket with a jerking motion of her head. She didn't trust anything that softened her guard. The soldier shrugged and laid the blanket on the ground beside her as if respecting unseen boundaries. A young German clerk whispered near her ear, "Why are they doing this?" Her voice cracked on the last word. "This isn't how enemies behave." Elise had no answer. A part of her wondered if the Americans were mocking them, offering civility as a way to highlight their defeat. Another part, buried deeper, felt something unfamiliar creeping through her. Confusion. genuine confusion. If these men meant to harm them, why hide it? Why act as if the women mattered? Across the yard, an American cook stirred another pot, adding thick chunks of potato with the casual generosity of someone who had never gone hungry. Elise watched him for a long moment. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, revealing sturdy forearms, not the monstrous hands the posters had shown her. He seemed more like a farmer than a fiend, but her fear refused to loosen. Kindness was just a different kind of trap, she told herself. It disarmed you before the real cruelty came. It made you step closer to the hand that would later strike. The wooden box throbbed faintly against her palm. She did not know why it felt warmer than before. She did not know what lay inside it, only that it was hers to protect. And as long as she clutched it, she still held some small piece of the world she once understood. Around her, the Americans went on with their quiet tasks, writing names on clipboards, distributing food, tying their boots. No one shouted. No one jeered. No one looked at the women as trophies of war. To any American watching from afar, the scene would seem simple. Just young soldiers doing their duty, living out the ideals their parents had instilled in them. Fairness, restraint, decency. But to Elise, the simplicity itself was unfathomable. If the enemy wasn't screaming or striking or threatening, then what was he? And why, for the first time since the war reached her doorstep, did Elise feel her fear shift, not fade but shift, into something she didn't yet have words for? She glanced once more at the blanket resting near her feet, then quickly looked away. Whatever the Americans were doing, she told herself, it couldn't be trusted. But the world she had been raised to believe in was already beginning to crack. The next morning broke with a dull, heavy sky that made the entire holding yard look as if it were submerged beneath a layer of gray glass. Dew clung to the fence wires, and the air carried the faint smell of wet ashes drifting from the burned fields nearby. Even in this bleakness, the Americans moved with a steady rhythm, an almost office-like routine that contrasted sharply with the chaos Elise had lived through for years. Soldiers walked down the lines of prisoners, clipboards in hand, calling names as best they could and writing numbers for identification tags. A medic paused at intervals to check wounds with quiet efficiency. No one barked orders, no one shoved. The discipline was strict, but it did not bruise. When a young private approached Elise, he slowed his step deliberately. Instead of standing over her, a posture that would have towered and intimidated, he knelt so that his face was level with hers. His expression was tired but plain, lacking any trace of cruelty. He tapped the blank tag gently with his pencil and asked, "Name?" She didn't understand the English word, but she understood the gesture. Her throat tightened. She gave a small nod and whispered, "Elise Weber." The private repeated it, sounding out each syllable carefully before writing it down. Then he offered a canteen. Elise refused, gripping the wooden medical box tighter. The private didn't insist. He simply placed the canteen on the ground beside her and moved on, leaving her with an unfamiliar feeling, an absence of pressure, an absence of threat. It bewildered her as much as any act of force would have. The yard hummed with subdued noise, boots scraping gravel, metal cups clinking, pencils scratching across paper. The Americans worked as if this were merely another assignment, another day in a long chain of days, not the processing of defeated enemies. Elise watched them with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant curiosity. She could not understand how soldiers could be so casual around those they had been taught to hate. She could not understand why no one looked at her with desire or vengeance in their eyes. But beneath her ribs, the wooden box shifted strangely. At first it was only a warmth, barely noticeable. Then, as the morning stretched on, she caught a sharper scent leaking through the cracks of the lid, metallic and sour, like vinegar mixed with rust. She tried to tell herself it was the old smell of disinfectant. Medical supplies sometimes carried such odors. But something in the tone of the scent felt wrong. It had a sting that crept into her nose and lingered. And then the fabric of her dress began to cling to her right side. She reached down quietly, pressing the spot with her fingertips. The cloth felt damp, warmer than it should have. She pulled her hand back quickly, unsure whether she had imagined the slight burn beneath her skin. She glanced around. None of the Americans seemed to notice, but a thread of fear curled down her spine. Nearby, two soldiers unloading crates paused mid-step. One sniffed the air. "Smells like solvent," he murmured to his partner, frowning. The other shrugged, assuming it came from some medical supply. They continued stacking their crates, unaware that the source of the smell sat only a few yards away, clutching her knees to her chest. Elise's pulse quickened. The officer who had given her the box had been explicit. Do not let it fall into enemy hands. She didn't know what the box contained, but she knew that if any chemical inside were discovered, the Americans might think it was sabotage, or a weapon, or something worse. And prisoners caught hiding dangerous materials, so she'd been told, would be punished without mercy. She shifted slightly, hoping to ease the growing sting along her ribs, but the movement only pressed the damp fabric more firmly against her skin. A faint hiss seemed to rise from the box, or perhaps from the cloth itself. Elise couldn't be sure. She tightened her arms around the box, blocking the sides with her elbows as if she could hide the smell by sheer will. In her mind, a storm of possibilities spun wildly. If the box was leaking something harmful, the Americans could accuse her of trying to poison someone. They might drag her out, interrogate her, punish her. Her throat tightened at the thought. Fear built upon fear, layer upon layer. She tried to steady her breathing, but each inhalation carried more of that sharp chemical note. Around her, the Americans went on with their tasks, entirely unaware of the small crisis unfolding inches from her body. One medic adjusted bandages on another prisoner and murmured something reassuring. A cook set up a second pot of soup, its steam billowing upward in soft, white curls. A guard paced beside the fence, scanning the horizon with mechanical focus. The normalcy of their movements only made Elise's inner panic worse. The world outside her skin was calm. The world inside felt like it was on the verge of tearing open. Far beyond the yard, across oceans and cities untouched by war rubble, a very different world was forming. Delegates in San Francisco were already gathering to discuss a new organization, a United Nations, that might build a peaceful order from the wreckage of old empires. Newspapers printed hopeful columns about the world after the war, speculating on diplomacy, rebuilding, cooperation. In Washington, planners spoke about America's moral responsibility to shape a future built not on revenge, but on stability. Elise knew none of this. She only knew the intimacy of fear and the sharpness of the scent growing stronger by the minute. But in some profound, invisible way, the way she was treated in this muddy yard would become part of that global story. America understood that how it dealt with prisoners, even enemy women, even terrified girls who carried secrets they didn't understand, would echo into the world it wanted to help build. Restraint was not an accident. It was policy, identity, and aspiration woven together. Elise pressed her hand gently against her side. This time, the sting made her gasp softly. The fabric seemed glued to her skin. She felt panic rising fast. If the Americans noticed, if they questioned her, she would have no answers. The box in her lap felt almost hot now, the wood warming as though something inside it breathed. She looked around, trying to appear calm. The private who had taken her name earlier knelt by another woman now, offering her a bandage for a blistered foot. His gentleness only heightened her dread. If these men were indeed as humane as they seemed, then any sign of concealed danger would be interpreted as betrayal. And betrayal had consequences. Elise angled her body slightly, pulling her coat around her ribs in a futile attempt to hide both the warmth and the smell. Instead, she pressed the dampened cloth more firmly against her skin. The burning worsened. She closed her eyes. Whatever was inside that wooden box, whatever chemical had cracked during the retreat, was no longer just a secret to protect. It was a fuse, a small, silent fuse that was already burning toward the moment when fear, misunderstanding, and mercy would collide all at once. The kindness of the American surrounded her like a fragile shell. But beneath it, something dangerous was beginning to glow. And Elise, trapped between loyalty, terror, and pain, did not yet realize that the box she clung to for safety was the very thing that would force her fate into the hands of a stranger. The moment began with a sound so small it could have been mistaken for a twig snapping. Elise shifted her weight, just a fraction, and the wooden box slipped from her trembling hands. It tumbled once, twice, then struck the gravel with a blunt crack. The lid split open at the hinge, and something inside gave a soft, popping hiss. A thin stream of dark liquid spilled across the stones, spreading in a widening arc. Immediately a sharp, acidic smell rose into the air, metallic, bitter, scorching. A faint white vapor curled upward, twisting like smoke from burning paper. The nearest medic froze, eyes widening. Then he shouted, "Chemical spill! Move! Move back!" His voice ripped through the quiet yard, jolting every soldier nearby. Instinct took hold. Several men stepped backward, hands flying to their rifles. One guard grabbed the shoulder of the man beside him, pulling him away from the fumes. Gravel crunched, boots scraped, breath caught in throats. Elise stared at the spreading liquid as if she had unleashed a curse. "They'll think it's a weapon. They'll think I meant to harm them. They'll kill me." Her hands flew to her side, clawing at the fabric that clung painfully to her ribs. But the cloth didn't budge. It had fused to her skin, glued there by the heat and the chemical soaking through it. She yanked harder, panic twisting her breath into thin gasps. The sting became a burn. The burn became agony. She stumbled backward, shoulders hitting the fence, eyes darting wildly from the medic to the soldiers to the smoke rising from the gravel. The fear she had carried for years, nurtured, fed, drilled into her bones, burst open at once. Every warning she had ever heard now roared inside her. "Foreign soldiers have no mercy. Americans will punish you. Better to die than be captured." Her scream tore out of her chest before she could stop it. Across the yard, Private Leonard Carter spun toward the sound. He saw the dark stain climbing Elise's dress. He saw her doubled over, gripping her side in terror, and he smelled what the medic had smelled, a solvent strong enough to burn flesh in minutes. "You have seconds," the medic barked. "Get the cloth off her." Carter didn't hesitate. His boots hammered the earth as he sprinted toward her, weaving past prisoners and guards. He wasn't the fastest runner in the unit, but in that moment he moved as though the ground itself were pushing him forward. Elise saw him coming, tall, urgent, eyes fixed on her side, and her heart seized. This was the monster the posters had shown her, the foreign soldier who would take what he wanted, the enemy she had been told to fear more than death itself. In her mind, he wasn't running toward danger. He was running toward her. "No, no, please, no," she sobbed, pressing herself back against the fence until the barbed wire bit into her shoulders. Carter didn't hear her words, only her fear. But he kept moving. He dropped to one knee in front of her, scanning the soaked cloth. The chemical had eaten a shiny patch into the cotton, and steam was rising from it. Her skin beneath was already reddening. "If it reaches deeper, she'll lose the tissue," he muttered, mostly to himself. He reached for the edge of her dress. Elise flinched, striking his arm in blind panic. "Don't touch me! Don't—" Her voice cracked, high and desperate. Carter raised both hands briefly, palms open. "Ma'am, it's burning you. I have to get it off." She didn't understand. All she saw was a man about to rip away her last defense. Behind them, other prisoners cried out. One shouted something in German that sounded like a warning. A young guard stepped forward so quickly his rifle slipped from his grasp and fell to the ground with a loud clatter. The medic shouted again. "Carter! Now!" Carter grabbed the contaminated cloth with both hands. Elise screamed. The sound of tearing fabric ripped through the yard, raw, violent, unmistakable. Her dress split open along the seam, the fibers snapping under Carter's grip. The stained patch peeled away from her skin with a wet, sickening tack. Elise collapsed onto her knees, arms clutched across her chest, shaking violently. The world spun. She could barely breathe. The other German women erupted into chaos, some shouting, some sobbing, some covering their faces. To them, the scene was exactly what they had been taught to fear, an American soldier forcing himself upon a helpless woman. But Carter didn't look at her exposed skin. He didn't look at her fear or her shame. He focused only on the burn, a spreading red patch blistered at the edges, glistening with a residue that hissed when droplets fell onto the stones. "Get me water," he yelled. The medic was already there, dropping to the ground with a canteen. He poured a steady stream over her ribs. The water hit the remaining chemical and sizzled loudly, sending up a puff of white steam. Elise jerked at the cold, at the pain, at the shock of everything happening at once. Carter tossed the contaminated cloth as far from her as he could. It landed in the dirt with a faint hiss. For a moment, no one spoke. The yard hung in a suspended breath, guards frozen, prisoners trembling, Americans exchanging quick, uncertain glances. It was impossible to tell whether a riot or a rescue was underway. Then, slowly, Carter peeled off his field jacket and stepped toward Elise again. He moved carefully, like approaching a frightened animal. "This is just for dignity," he murmured. He placed the jacket gently around her shoulders, making sure it didn't brush the burned skin. Elise shrank from his hand anyway, her body drawn tight as a wire. She didn't look at him. She didn't want to see the face of the man who had torn her clothing away, even if some distant part of her recognized that he had done it to save her. Two medics lifted her carefully to her feet. Her legs wobbled, barely holding her up. The jacket hung loosely around her, heavy with the smell of dust, wool, and the faint warmth of Carter's body. They guided her toward the medical tent, her breath shaking with each step. Behind her, Carter stood motionless, chest heaving, knuckles white. He had acted on instinct, on training, and yet the look in Elise's eyes when she had screamed lingered like a bruise. He had saved her, but she believed he had harmed her. Inside the tent, Elise's breakdown came quietly. Tears slid down her cheeks before she realized she was crying. Pain throbbed along her ribs. Confusion twisted through her mind. The interpreter's voice filtered through the haze like distant thunder. She managed to whisper, "Why did he tear it? Was he angry with me?" The interpreter hesitated, glancing back at Carter standing stiffly near the tent entrance. Carter's jaw clenched, his eyes dark with something deeper than exhaustion, fear that he had done the right thing and would still be remembered as a brute. He stepped forward, voice low but firm. "No," he said, "not angry, not for a second. I was trying to help." The interpreter repeated his words softly in German. Elise closed her eyes. Her breath trembled. She didn't fully understand yet, but something inside her loosened, just barely. Outside, the camp resumed its quiet rhythm, but no one forgot the sound of that rip. It lingered in the air like an unanswered question. In that moment, raw, terrifying, misunderstood, the fear of one woman had collided with the duty of one man. And the truth had not yet finished rising from the smoke. The medical tent was warmer than the yard outside, dimly lit by lanterns that hummed softly as if trying to soothe the air. Elise sat on a low cot, Carter's jacket draped around her shoulders like a borrowed shield. The fabric smelled of dust, canvas, and something faintly comforting, something she had no name for yet. Sergeant Hill, the medic, worked with deliberate care. He dabbed her ribs with cool water, wiped away the last traces of the corrosive liquid, and examined the reddened skin with the practiced eye of someone who had treated far worse in the past year. He glanced at the interpreter, a German-speaking American civilian who had been attached to the unit. "Tell her this," Hill said quietly. It was burning her. He had to act fast. Another minute, and it would have scarred deep. The interpreter knelt beside Elise and translated gently. She listened without blinking, her fingers clutching the jacket as if afraid it might slip away. When the words reached her, burning, scar, had to act. Something inside her stilled. She didn't speak for several seconds, letting the truth settle into the cracks where fear had lived for years. Finally, in a voice barely louder than a breath, she said, "Tell him. Thank you." The interpreter rose and walked to where Carter stood near the entrance, nervously shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His face was pale, his sleeves damp from the earlier chaos. When he heard the interpreter relay Elise's words, Carter swallowed hard. Relief softened the tightness in his jaw. "Tell her I wasn't angry," he said quickly. "Not for a second." When this message was carried back to Elise, she shut her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek, not from pain this time, but from the release of something heavier. The terror she had felt, the certainty that he wanted to harm her, began to crumble. It left her feeling strange and unmoored. The enemy she had feared was not the enemy standing before her now. Hill finished bandaging her ribs, tying the cloth gently. "She'll be all right," he muttered to himself, though Elise understood the tone even if not the words. Then he stepped away, giving her space to breathe. Elise's breathing steadied. Her hands loosened their grip on the jacket. For the first time since her capture, her shoulders lowered from around her ears. When she finally stepped out of the tent, the afternoon light had softened into amber. The yard looked different now, not kinder, not safer, but clearer. Carter's jacket hung around her like a quiet declaration that the worst she had imagined had not come to pass. As she walked back to the other prisoners, conversations rippled through the line. "Han ze vai ko ai," one woman whispered sharply. "Kong," another murmured, shaking her head. "Han ku ko ai." Both versions hung in the air, neither fully wrong. It was the strange paradox of that moment. Fear clashing with reality, assumptions colliding with truth. In a way, the yard became a small model of what would happen across Europe after the war. Stories diverging, memories splitting, each person clinging to the narrative that made the most sense to them. Elise kept her eyes down, her fingers tugging the jacket closer around her, not out of shame, but out of something else. Gratitude, maybe. Or disbelief that she, who had been taught only terror, had been saved by the hands she feared most. Across the yard, Carter watched her. He didn't approach, didn't want to startle her, but the way she held his jacket told him she no longer saw him as a monster. It was enough. The world beyond their small camp pulsed with change. More than 350,000 German POWs were already in American custody across Europe and North America. Reports documented how they were fed enough calories to regain weight, how they were treated for illness and injury, how many had been sent to farms or construction crews and paid modest wages. Red Cross inspectors moved freely through camps, confirming conditions that, while imperfect, were far better than what prisoners faced under other regimes. America was not flawless, no nation was, but compared to the vengeance unfolding in the East, or the hard reprisals seen in other corners of the collapsing Reich, the American system held to something steadier: rules, restraint, and a belief that dignity should not vanish with surrender. It wasn't kindness born of sentiment. It was kindness born of discipline, of a country that wanted its moral standing to outlast the war itself. Elise did not know these numbers or reports, but she felt the truth of them in the hands that had bandaged her, the jacket placed around her shoulders, the distance Carter kept now to avoid frightening her again. A little later, the interpreter approached her once more. "They need a statement for the medical report," he explained, offering her paper and a short pencil. "Just a few words." Elise hesitated. The paper looked too clean, too white, too honest. She held the pencil awkwardly, thinking of all the things she could write: her terror, her shame, her confusion. But when she finally leaned over the page, only one simple line came to her hand. "I thought the soldier meant harm. Instead, he saved me." She paused, staring at the words. They felt like a confession, or perhaps the first brick in a new belief she didn't fully trust yet. The interpreter read the sentence silently, nodded, and folded the paper for the report. Elise exhaled slowly, as though releasing something she had carried for years. Nearby, Carter turned away from the setting sun, watching the prisoners settle into their quiet evening. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw only a frightened woman he had tried to help, and for whom he had nearly become the embodiment of every nightmare she'd ever been told. Yet her written words, those small trembling marks on paper, changed something inside him too. They made him hope that the war, in all its brutality, hadn't erased the ability of strangers to understand each other. In the fading light, prisoner and soldier stood in the same yard, breathing the same cold air, each realizing that fear had been their true enemy, not each other. And in that shared understanding, even if only for a moment, the world they had inherited seemed capable of becoming something better. Elisa's life, after the war ended, moved quietly back into the rhythm of ordinary years. She returned to Germany, built a small home, and raised children who grew up in a world far calmer than the one she had known. She didn't speak often about the war. Not the hunger, not the fear, not the days when every sound meant danger. But every so often, on winter evenings when the wind shook the windows, one of her children would ask why she kept an old American jacket folded neatly in a drawer. She would rest her hand on the worn fabric and answer, "A man I feared more than death gave me this. He gave me my dignity back when I thought I had none left." She never described the ripping of her dress or the sting of the chemical burn in detail. She spoke instead about the moment after, the gentleness in a stranger's voice, the realization that an enemy soldier had been willing to risk misunderstanding, even hatred, to stop her pain. She carried that memory the rest of her life. Across the ocean, Leonard Carter slipped back into American life with the quiet steadiness common to so many returning veterans. He became a teacher, history, ironically, and spent his days guiding young minds through the stories of wars most had not lived to see. Sometimes, as he erased chalk from the blackboard or sorted essays at his desk, the memory of that day outside Leipzig returned, the hiss of chemical on gravel, the scream that tore through the yard, and the terrified eyes of the woman he had tried to save. He never forgot that she believed, for a moment, that he was there to harm her, and he never forgot the look that came later, the cautious recognition that he had not been her enemy after all. Over time, their story became part of something much larger. It echoed among thousands of other moments lived by prisoners and guards in the closing months of the war. In camps across Europe and North America, former German soldiers, some barely older than boys, found themselves surprised by the treatment they received. They were fed enough to regain weight. They were seen by doctors, given blankets, allowed to write letters. Many were put to work on farms or construction sites, earning small wages they could later send home. Years later, in interviews in church basements, in memoirs and quiet conversations with grandchildren, countless POWs would repeat the same sentiment. The Americans fed us. They treated us like human beings. It was a small sentence, but it traveled far. It shaped how post-war Germany saw the United States. It softened old wounds and built unexpected bridges between former enemies. And eventually, it became one of the reasons why America's reputation in Europe after the war was not merely as a victorious power, but as a moral one. This is where the 4 layers of emotion settle, where the story reaches beyond Elise and Carter and speaks directly to the American heart. Pride and gratitude first. Because America's greatest weapon in 1945 wasn't just its tanks or its bombers. It wasn't the steel from Pittsburgh or the aircraft from Willow Run. It was the decision, made day after day, soldier after soldier, to treat even defeated enemies with restraint and dignity, to follow rules when the world was breaking, to choose humanity when no one could have blamed them for choosing vengeance. Then nostalgia, the sweet ache of remembering a nation united by purpose. Your fathers, your grandfathers didn't just win a war. They proved that power without mercy is not victory at all. They showed that a country's greatness is measured not only in strength, but in the quiet moments when someone chooses to be decent simply because it is right. Then reflection, a comparison between the America of then and the America of now. Today, the nation can feel divided, loud, uncertain. People argue over everything. Trust feels fragile. Unity feels distant. And so the story asks a gentle question. In a time when our country feels divided, noisy, uncertain, what would a young private like Leonard Carter think if he looked at us now? Would he recognize the America that taught him to save a frightened enemy instead of punish her? Would he see the same compass that once guided a generation to act with discipline, restraint, and grace, even in the darkest moments? And finally, gratitude, especially for the descendants of POWs. Because some who watch this story today had grandparents who surrendered to American troops. Some grew up hearing fragments, just fragments, of kindness that seemed impossible in wartime, and this story is for them too. If your grandfather or grandmother once wore a German uniform and survived in American custody, They may have carried a moment like Elisa's silently in their memory, a moment when an American soldier's compassion shaped the rest of their life, a moment that proved mercy can ripple through generations. Elise carried such a moment. Carter did too. Her words, written shakily on a page in the medical tent, became the quiet truth that bridged their lives. I thought the soldier meant harm. Instead, he saved me. Decades later, that truth still stands, and so we end where the heart of this story truly lies. In the end, the war did not remember the uniforms. It remembered the moments when someone chose mercy over fear. Sometimes all it took was the sound of a dress tearing in the cold air of 1945.